Hi there, welcome back to my channel. My name's Zoe, and this is the Words on Wealth channel. Hopefully, giving you things to learn, think about, and talk about when it comes to money and wealth. Hopefully, you're finding it useful so far. If you are, do give me a like, follow. I've also got an Instagram, and we'll hopefully have a Substack and potentially a TikTok coming soon as well. As I mentioned, I'll be focusing on learning, but also on other bits of content that I've either read, listened to, or watched in recent times. I have been asked so many times in the last few years for recommendations of the likes of books and podcasts, and I feel like whenever I get asked the question, my mind goes totally blank. And I totally forget all of the fantastic things that I have read, consumed, or whatever over the last few years. Indeed, lifetime sounds a bit extreme, but you get the idea. There's so much out there, and there's so much that I've enjoyed that it really is time to share some of it. So, this first one is going to be just about the book that I've read most recently, but have really enjoyed. The book is Inheritocracy. This was actually a book my mum bought me for Christmas. And when the tagline said it's time to talk about the bank of mum and dad, I didn't know if she was trying to give me a hint, but clearly not. For context, she was also an economics teacher for most of my life. So she does have a certain vested interest in economy and other financial matters as well. So it goes to show that her Christmas presents do tie into some of the reading matter that she gives me as well. So, Inheritocracy is written by a woman called Dr. Eliza Filby, and it starts with a little bit around her life story. Essentially, she grew up in Tooting in London, for anybody that's unfamiliar, and she is firmly a millennial, as am I, but I'm a little bit more on the cusp. I suspect she's around 10 years older than me. Just for context, I am 30, and that means that I'm right at the edge of being a millennial, but I certainly don't consider myself Gen Z. It's certainly an interesting examination of millennials and how they've grown up, particularly in the UK. So, as I say, it's called Inheritocracy, and it's a real examination of what life has been like from a financial perspective for our generation, basically, millennials. Some reviews that I've read have said that it's Dolly Alderton meets finance. Now, for anybody that is unaware, Dolly Alderton is a similar millennial writer who had a really big podcast back in the day called The High Low. It was fantastic. And they basically, her and her co host, Pandora Sykes, looked at lots of different aspects of the news. I digress, back to Inheritocracy. It is light-hearted, and it's not necessarily a depressing review of what millennials have faced when it comes to their finances. But it's certainly a realistic and pragmatic view of some of the difficulties that have been faced by this generation, particularly in the UK. For anybody that is scratching their head or hasn't already Googled it by this point of the video, millennials are those that were generally born in between the 80s and mid 90s. So you can get the idea as to some of the things that they might have gone through. Firstly, the dot-com boom, a huge level of digital transformation throughout their lives. The 2008 crash could well have come at a really pinnacle time, be it just as they were going to uni, graduating. We also then saw the likes of university fees change, and then entering a world where things like property ownership and getting on the ladder has become ever more difficult. Not to mention the sprinkling of the pandemic in there as well that we saw 5 years ago now. Can't believe it was 5 years ago, as a digression. So she starts off by really digging into some of the illusions of a meritocracy, which, as somebody who studied languages, which is an art subject as of such, I can certainly relate to it. And I think for me, that's one of the main takeaways of the book is the kind of relatability that I particularly saw throughout. I didn't grow up in London at all, and she did, but I can certainly see the threads of relatability that go on through. One of the interesting points that she also makes about this illusion of meritocracy is surrounding that of life in London and also those that have access to the likes of houses in London. And it's something that I know that I've really grappled with. As I just said there, I didn't grow up in London. I grew up in the north of England in a county called North Yorkshire, in a lovely little town called Harrogate. But one of the things that I found upon graduating was that actually to get a graduate and entry level job in London was pretty tough, not only because you needed potentially some contacts to get you in there. But also the salaries that they paid, when you look then at how much rent cost, they were wildly mismatched. So those that were able to live, for example, with parents or other family members or relatives in that point at the early stages of career were able to accelerate the London salary that was going to come, albeit low at the beginning, whilst actually then still progressing. They were able to accelerate their career on that London ladder without necessarily having to face some of the difficulties of the likes of really high rent. However, as we've reached the latter parts of 20s and into 30s, those that had potentially moved in with parents or relatives and were on the London career path have found it harder and harder to move out. Not least of which because it's actually still so expensive, and the likes of buying a property for many are out of reach in London. And it's something that she touches upon as well, and a really interesting, again, level of relatability that I found with this book, which is that actually I never knew if I felt more sorry for those that struggle to break into the London life because they don't necessarily have that foot into property, or those that are actually from London, live in London, have to move back in with their parents, and then can't really see any prospect of getting out because for those, for example, from the north, moving back to the north might be quite appealing. They've got potentially family and other levels of community there. And of course, the property is cheaper. For those from London, this might not be the case. It could be a totally random area of the country that they don't really want to move to because they don't have any family, friends, community, or bases there. So it's a really interesting, provocative sections that she picks up on and how they play out. It's not necessarily negative, and it certainly doesn't offer any solutions to this problem, but it does make you think. And for me, it did really reinforce some of the things that perhaps you've maybe pondered, thought about, knew, but puts it and translates it into writing. So from the housing issues, she moves into some of the feminist issues as well, that particularly millennial women have faced over the last few years. Things like real increases in nursery fees, how this impacts their overall career, but also the environment in which we've been brought up in. I think we were very much one of the first generations to believe that we really, truly could have a level playing field. We were very lucky to be brought up, most of us. Of course, I'm generalizing greatly here, and she doesn't necessarily in the book, but there is an assumption that people perhaps are relating to it throughout, that actually, yeah, we did grow up and we did go to school believing that we were on a similar playing field to, for example, my brother and any other male peers. Actually entering the world of work suggests that is not quite the case. And when you look at the stats on things like pay gap, pension gap, and wealth gap, they would certainly suggest too that it's still not quite the case. So from the feminist stuff, she then moves into a really interesting debate around class, and notably how that's shifted in the UK, and also how the big class quiz was released back a few years ago, and what the impact of this was. It's certainly a sticky subject. It's not one that people necessarily like to think about or talk about. So I quite enjoyed reading about it in the book because I find that it is such a loaded topic. No matter who you talk to about it, everybody has their own hang-up situation with the idea of class. And I think particularly in the UK, where it is relatively prominent potentially, and don't get me wrong, it is definitely prominent in other countries as well. As I said in a previous video, I started my career in Italy, and I know that there are similar class issues there, but it is something that we have quite prominently here in the UK. And it's an interesting examination to see from a literary perspective again, that you can read and think through yourself as well, because I'm very aware, as I say, that we do all have our own thoughts and hang-ups on it. And then she rounds off, and I don't want to ruin it, with talking about what it looks like next. Will it all be okay? Will we be the generation that actually is set to inherit the most ever? Or will some of that be dampened by the likes of caring for parents and those associated care fees? Of course, there's no crystal ball, so there's no necessarily answers at the end of it. But I really would recommend it as a read for anybody that's wanting to get a bit more of a critical view, perhaps, on the wider economy and what millennials have faced. For anybody that's looking for something a little bit thought-provoking, it's necessarily negative, as I say. It's not something that's finger-pointing at any particular group, any area, or at least my takeaway wasn't that was the case. It was a relatively neutral view on some of those issues that have been faced as an economy and as a certain generational group, if you like. So I enjoyed it greatly, and it's certainly one that I'd have a look at if you're looking for a thought-provoking read that is still relatively light-hearted and easy. So there you have it, Inheritocracy, which was my first book of this section of my YouTube channel. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you enjoy the book as well if you do go away and read it. Do let me know in the comments if you do come around to it and what your thoughts are on and what your thoughts are on it too. It would always be great to hear. See you soon, and bye for now.